I think we first need to address the question, what is Gethsemane?
Then Gethsemane literally means the place of the oil press.
We have in our mind the Garden of Gethsemane, almost as if it's a formal title, but that never appears in the Gospels.
And so starting in the 4th century, an area on the west slope of the Mount of Olives started to be identified by pilgrims as the location of Gethsemane. So what does this reconstruction mean for a reading of the New Testament Gospels?
But all of a sudden there's a certain event that comes up that really kind of opens the door, so to speak, for the first time. So let's talk a little bit about, within the context of Gethsemane, I think we first need to address the question, what is Gethsemane? Because we often think like, okay, Gethsemane, it's a garden, but that's not actually the case. So tell me a little bit about like, what is the meaning of Gethsemane, and what should we be thinking when we think of the word Gethsemane?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the word Gethsemane evokes the gospel narratives of Jesus's final night in Jerusalem before his crucifixion. So all 4 Gospels tell the story of Jesus having a Last Supper with his disciples in Jerusalem, and then at the conclusion of that Last Supper, going to a location on the Mount of Olives where he spends the rest of that night prior to his arrest. And of course, he'll be arrested, tried, and crucified the next day. In those Gospels, 2 of the Gospels use the word Gethsemane. One Gospel, the Gospel of John, just simply says he went to a place where there was a garden. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But the earliest Gospel accounts in Mark and Matthew, they both say that when Jesus and the disciples left the place of the Last Supper, they went across the Kidron Valley and went to a place called Gethsemane. And so that name becomes really critical to understanding the larger context of the scriptural and archaeological site. As most scholars look at those 2 early gospel narratives, most have agreed that the name Gethsemane is a Greek transliteration of 2 words in Hebrew or also in Aramaic. And those 2 words are the word got, which in Hebrew and Aramaic means to press or to crush, and the word shemen, which in Hebrew and also in Aramaic variant means oil. And so if that interpretation is correct, which I think it is, then Gethsemane literally means the place of the oil press, which means that this garden location that Jesus and the disciples visited on the Mount of Olives after the Last Supper actually seems to have been an oil pressing facility, a place where on normal years and in the time of Jesus, olives would have been harvested, they would have been crushed, pressed, the oil would have been extracted. And as we all know, oil is such an important part of the New Testament world. So that's what we can tell about the nature of the site, just based on the words Gethsemane, found in Mark and Matthew, and combine that with the word garden or agricultural space used in the Gospel of John.
And I think we should note, we have in our mind the Garden of Gethsemane, almost as if it's a formal title, but that never appears in the Gospels. It's either garden or Gethsemane, but never together. And so there is this context that we as later Christians have combined that, but there really is no official term in the Bible, in the New Testament, the Garden of Gethsemane.
That's right.
It's just Gethsemane or a garden.
Yeah, that's right. As far as I can tell, I think the first time Christians started conflating John's garden and the synoptic Gethsemane, I think might have been around the time of the Crusades, around the 12th century. So it's a quite late conflation. Now, having said that, yes, that term is not scriptural, but I think it's a reasonable assumption that both John on the one hand and the synoptic gospels on the other really do seem to be referring to the same location. All these gospels frame the story slightly differently among themselves, which I think itself is an important part of the conversation. But having said that, I really think that all 4 gospels give us valuable insight into the nature of the location, the nature of Jesus' experience there, and as we'll see in a moment, it can all illuminate what the archaeological findings have discovered.
Yeah, let's go into a little bit on that. You briefly talked about the different accounts, let's kind of go through those accounts as to how they describe the location, because I think that can be significant. That a lot of times we kind of harmonize the Gospels, but let's actually examine each of the four Gospels, or at least some of the Gospels, to kind of see, like, how is it that they describe these
Yeah.
events?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say that all four Gospels do have a similar context for the story of Jesus' last night. All four Gospels, for example, tell the story of Jesus and his disciples leaving the room of the Last Supper. All four of them describe Jesus and the disciples going to this place on the Mount of Olives. And they generally tell the similar story about his arrest there. But beyond that broad context, each gospel does slightly frame it differently. And I think all of those differences are so rich and so interesting. So if we want to just survey those traditions briefly, I would say that we need to start with the earliest surviving gospel accounts, which would be the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, both of which have a very close relationship with each other, probably explaining why they're so similar. But in Mark and Matthew, we're told that Jesus and the disciples finish the Last Supper. They cross the Kidron Valley, and they go to a place called Gethsemane, which, as we already said, is the place of the oil press, or the oil crushing. And in Mark and Matthew, when Jesus and the disciples arrive at this place called Gethsemane, Jesus breaks up the 12 into a couple different groups. He says to, a few of them, he says, "You watch here and pray. I'm going to go in a little further." And then he takes Peter, James, and John with him, and then he asks them to watch and pray. And then Jesus goes in yet a little bit further. And as the disciples are supposed to be watching and praying, although in these accounts, of course, they all quickly fall asleep. It's so late at night after a long meal. Matthew and Mark both frame this as a Passover night. So the disciples fall asleep, but the main story in Mark and Matthew is Jesus going into Gethsemane and falling on his face and falling on the ground and praying to God that God would remove the cup from Jesus. The cup being Jesus' upcoming suffering, death on the cross. And so it's this moment, a very human moment in those earliest Gospels, of Jesus wrestling with his coming fate, feeling the weight and the burden of his messianic mission on the final night before the crucifixion, and begging God in prayer, prostrate on the ground, to remove that cup. But then, of course, the most famous line probably in both narratives is when Jesus then turns his will over to the will of the Father and says, "But nevertheless, it's not what I want, but what you want." And then he gets up and finds the disciples asleep, and the different accounts have that exchange happening a few times. But then at the end of that narrative, the arresting party shows up, and Jesus is betrayed by Judas, one of the 12, and the arresting party then takes Jesus from Gethsemane into the city, where he's then later tried and the next day would be executed. So that's the core story, is found in the earliest surviving New Testament accounts of Mark and Matthew. The third synoptic gospel, meaning the third gospel that maintains that same basic literary framework, is the Gospel of Luke. But Luke does make some really interesting adjustments to the story. He has a different perspective on what happens there. The way Luke tells the story is he also has them leaving the Last Supper, coming to this place. Luke does not mention the name of the place. He just simply says the place on the Mount of Olives. And as Luke describes them going to the place, Luke's version takes a lot more attention off of the disciples and focuses almost exclusively on Jesus. And Luke does this by adding a few details that are really, really interesting. For example, Luke is the one who says that when Jesus went into this place and began praying, he was in, and the Greek word is agonia, he was in agony. And being in agony, he prayed more intensely. And then in the Greek, it reads that his sweat became so heavy that it was like great drops of blood. And Luke uses this metaphor that the sweat was so intense that it was like he was sweating blood. And then there's another detail as well that even has an angel showing up and strengthening him and helping him through this moment. These details are very powerful. There are some interesting conversations about how early some of these details are. They are in some biblical manuscripts and not in others. But I think most New Testament scholars today believe that probably these represent an early core tradition of the Gethsemane story. But the way we understand Luke's version, I think, has varied over the centuries. Today, When we read Luke's account of Jesus being in agony and sweating like it was great drops of blood, and having an angel strengthen him, we could read this as a modern reader as if Luke is emphasizing the suffering of Jesus way beyond even what Mark and Matthew had. And that's a really powerful perspective that might not be the way that ancient readers would have understood the story. If you take these very concepts, these same ideas, the same metaphor, the word agonia, or the sweating as it were great drops of blood, this kind of simile, and read these in the first century in the context of Greco-Roman literature that Luke and his audience would have been familiar with, all of these terms are fairly commonly used in reference to an athlete preparing for the great competition, right? Preparing for the great showdown, for the great contest. And so in a first century context, it very well might be that the way Luke is reframing the Gethsemane story is not by intensifying Jesus' suffering, but by showing Jesus as if he is an athlete getting ready to enter the great arena and preparing. He's sweating, as it were, great drops of blood. He's in agonia, which is the intense preparation of an athlete as he's getting ready to have the great showdown. And if that connection is accurate, which I think it is, and most other New Testament scholars believe that is there as well, then it seems that what Luke is doing is actually highlighting Jesus' preparation for the great showdown with sin and death in the form of the cross. So it's a really unique way of kind of recasting the story a bit, rather than seeing Jesus on the ground, begging the Father to remove the cup and submitting his will to the will of the Father. Luke almost presents Jesus as if he's an athlete getting ready to encounter the great opponent, which in this case would be sin and death on the cross. So that's how the synoptic tradition narrates the Gethsemane story, with those slight variants. Then you could turn to the Gospel of John, and it's an entirely different story altogether. John also has it after the Last Supper. They go across the Kidron Valley. So John has them going through the valley across from the Temple Mount. And he says that they go to a garden. So John emphasizes not the name Gethsemane. John emphasizes the agricultural nature of the site. And what John does not do is talk about Jesus' suffering at all. John does not include the word Gethsemane. He does not include Jesus agonizing like he does in Luke. John does not include Jesus submitting his will to the Father like in Mark and Matthew. Instead, John focuses entirely on the arrest of Jesus. And the way that John tells the story of Jesus' arrest in the garden is by having the arresting party show up and have Jesus approach them and say, "Who do you seek?" And they say, "Well, we're seeking Jesus of Nazareth." And in the Greek, it's really interesting because Jesus says in response in John's account, he says, "You seek Jesus of Nazareth, ego eimi," which is the Greek way to say, "I am." And the arresting party falls backwards to the ground. And that happens 3 times. Well, this story is not in the synoptic tradition. This is uniquely in John. So what John seems to be doing is instead of focusing on the suffering of Jesus in Gethsemane, focusing on Jesus, almost like it's a revelation of his divine nature in the garden, by having Jesus say, "Ego eimi," or "I am," and the group falls to the ground. He very well might be alluding to the name "I am" from the book of Exodus, right? When Moses at the burning bush asks the name of the God of Israel, and God says, "I am that I am." And in Greek, the Greek Septuagint, that is ego eimi, I am. And so John seems to have replaced the suffering of Jesus in the synoptics with a revelation of Jesus's divine identity. Same night, same space, likely, but 2 different framings of the account there. So that's just a very quick overview of what we would see in the 4 Gospels. And I think your point is a really important one, which is we often are tempted to artificially harmonize the Gospels, blend them together into one story that really scripturally does not exist. I think it's much more powerful to separate out the 4 accounts, to see how Mark and Matthew frame it, how Luke adjusts that, and then how John reframes it. I just think that is so much more interesting in terms of not only scriptural literacy, getting to know your biblical texts better, but just different vantage points of what that last night meant for Jesus' ministry, I think is extremely important.
Well, and it gives you different perspectives and different views where when you try to harmonize it, you really lose all of that. And
That's right.
so there really is a beauty when you can look at each individual and say, okay, what are they trying to teach us as Christians about this story because they each have a different thing that they really want us to understand from the story.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so we not only by separating them out get to hear the individual voices of the different gospel authors, but we also get a sense of what their individual audiences might be interested in or what they might need. And so it just adds depth and richness to all four accounts that we lose when we artificially blend them together into a harmony.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, so we've already talked a little bit about the word Gethsemane and the meaning of being an olive press, but let's now talk about what would you expect to find at a Gethsemane, at a location where they're producing olive oil. What are types of things that we have from other locations that we can kind of interpret or reinterpret what it would look like at the time of Jesus?
Yeah, that's a great question. And fortunately, in the last few decades, archaeological excavations throughout the land of Israel have given us lots of great examples of what we would expect to find in a Gethsemane or olive processing facility. One of the consistent features across all of these examples is that a Gethsemane site would probably be broken up into two different parts. The first part would be the orchard of olive trees themselves, right? So before we can press the olives and extract the oil, we first have to grow the olives and harvest the olives. And this was usually done in an orchard of olive trees, which in the Judean hill country often existed in terraces going up hillsides to maximize the agricultural space. So if we're thinking about the site of Gethsemane in Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives, that's probably the first part that we would imagine is a terraced orchard of olive trees going up the slopes of the Mount of Olives, rows of olive trees that in the fall harvest, workers would come to, would harvest, would pluck the olives, would maybe beat the branches, maybe climb up in ladders, gather the olives together in baskets. And that's kind of step one of the process. But the next few steps would usually take place in the oil press itself, right? Or the New Testament might say in the Gethsemane itself. And one of the things that's fascinating about the archaeological excavations of these facilities in the last few decades is that they have shown that consistently the next steps of the process almost always takes place in an indoor facility, right? Which means that in the hillside around Jerusalem, they're probably going to repurpose natural caves or grottos in which the actual pressing or processing of the olives themselves would occur. And so the features that would usually be found in a cave or a grotto include things like a massive crushing basin. We have found so many examples of limestone crushing basins where the olives that were harvested in the orchard would be brought into the grotto, brought into the cave, dumped into a large limestone basin, and then taking a large limestone grinding wheel would wheel it around and would crush the olives into a kind of an olive mash almost at the bottom of the basin. So those are consistent features in these facilities. And then the next consistent feature would be the press itself. So after crushing the olives in a crushing basin, workers would then scoop up the olive mash and put them into small bags made of like thin rope called frails, right? And these frails would then be stacked up underneath a press within the grotto or within the cave. In the time of Jesus, the way these olive presses or oil presses looked is they typically were a large wooden beam that were anchored into a wall of the cave. And underneath the beam is where you would stack the baskets of olive mash. Then, once you've stacked the baskets of olive mash, on the other end of the beam, you would then apply large stone weights, or maybe weights that were stationary, and through a winching system, you might connect it, but somehow you connect the beam with the weights and you crush the beam, you press the beam down. And as the beam is coming down, it crushes the bags of oil of olive mash, and out of the individual pores of the bags would come out the oil. The oil would just drip out or ooze out the side and would all go into a collecting basin at the base of the oil press. And so that those two features there, the large crushing basin with the large grinding stone, and then the beam press were two really critical features for the crushing and the pressing of the olives and for the extracting of the oil. And then we also know that once the oil is extracted from the bags, then, of course, it needs to be stored. And so we know from other archaeological excavations that workers would then take ladles and ladle the olive oil from the collecting basin and put them into large storage jars that they would then stack up either alongside the wall of the facility or maybe even in a separate storage room where you'd have rows of storage jars. And there the oil would sit as the oil is being produced throughout the harvest season until the oil supply is ready to then go out to buyers at the market, institutions who are, contracting use for the oil, such as maybe the temple or other sites. And so that's what we know now about how oil production works in the time of Jesus. So when we're reading about a garden that might also have a name of Gethsemane or oil press, those are the features that we would expect to see in the New Testament site: a terraced orchard of olive trees, a cave with a crushing basin and a beam press, and maybe even some space for storage for the oil.
Very nice. So if we have this in mind, then that's what we need to be, and we'll talk more about this later, but that's what we need to be looking for, is these kind of types of items or locations within the Gethsemane. But
Right.
before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about the site itself and kind of the history of what it happened next. So we obviously have this location, this cave, but what happens next? What's the next part of the story, so to speak?
Yeah, so it's also a great question. So, as far as we can tell, just from other historical records and the larger context of the period, whatever the site of Gethsemane looked like in the time of the New Testament, and we'll talk more about the details of that in a moment. But however we'd imagine the site of Gethsemane as found in the New Testament Gospels, it's almost certainly that site fell into disuse and disrepair probably after the year 70 AD, when the Roman legions surrounded Jerusalem, besieged the city. And the Jewish historian Josephus actually tells us that they cut down all of the trees on the Mount of Olives and set up their siege works in the very area that we would expect to find the New Testament Gethsemane. And so we would expect, just based on historical records, that the site of Gethsemane as an agricultural facility almost certainly fell into disuse, probably was heavily damaged during the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70. And given the aftermath of that siege, probably just lay abandoned throughout the second and maybe even the third centuries AD. So we can imagine the terraces collapsing. We can imagine the grotto itself just being filled with wash and whatever debris. But around the 4th century, everything changes, because in the 4th century AD is when Christianity becomes not only a legalized religion in the Roman Empire, but by the end of the 4th century, it actually becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire itself, under the Roman Emperor Constantine and his later successors. So during that 4th century period, Christian pilgrims from around the Roman Empire, around the Mediterranean world and beyond, started coming to Jerusalem as a way to connect with the holy sites found in the New Testament Gospels. They're described in the New Testament Gospels. And one of the sites that these pilgrims wanted to connect with was the site of Gethsemane, where Jesus spent his final night before his crucifixion, where he offered his prayer, and where he was arrested. And so starting in the 4th century, an area on the west slope of the Mount of Olives started to be identified by pilgrims as the location of Gethsemane. And it's always hard to know with these pilgrimage accounts how accurate some of their identifications were. In some cases, they seem to be pretty imaginative with their identification of holy sites. But in other places, it's very possible that they preserved longstanding Christian traditions that could even go back to the 2nd or 1st centuries AD. In the case of Gethsemane, pilgrims had identified a plot of land that they often associated with the garden, probably an area that by that point had regrown a lot of the olive trees. But they had also identified a grotto or a cave that they believed was part of the original Gethsemane site. And so by the time of the Byzantine period in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries AD, Christian pilgrims are coming to Jerusalem. And in addition to visiting the other holy sites, they're also going to the Mount of Olives, where they would hold services, both at the garden location where they had built a church and in this grotto that was part of the larger land area, where they would go down. Some pilgrims described going down with candles lit into the grotto, and they would read scripture and sing songs, sing hymns relating to Jesus's suffering, his prayer, his arrest. And so, as a result of these pilgrims coming to the Mount of Olives, the land on the Mount of Olives that is today still commemorated by the modern Church of All Nations. If any viewers or listeners have ever been to the Holy Land on a tour, almost certainly they've gone to the Church of All Nations to commemorate Gethsemane. Well, that church and the grotto right across the street still today have been, remain pilgrimage destinations to commemorate these events. I'll just say very briefly that pilgrimage tradition to these locations began in the Byzantine period. During that time, the grotto itself was converted into a chapel. So you can imagine going to the large church by the garden, by the grotto, or by the orchard, and then you can imagine going down into the grotto, where now, instead of seeing the features of a first century oil press, now you're going to see mosaic pavement. You're going to see an altar. You're going to see space for Christian liturgy and Christian worship, and that was going to be the condition of the Gethsemane site all the way into the Islamic period of the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries AD. In that time, the site of Gethsemane began experiencing a lot of changing of hands, right? So there would be times in the Islamic and early medieval period when the site of Gethsemane was in local Islamic possession. We know, for example, that at some point the Byzantine chapel in the grotto was actually converted into an Islamic tomb, where actually you had several graves being punched right through the old mosaic floor. Dozens of these Islamic period, early medieval period graves. We know, for example, that the church at the site of the modern church was destroyed sometime in this period. And so all the way through the Middle Ages, the land itself kind of changed hands and was used for various purposes. I'd say by the end of the medieval period, though, the church site and the grotto had become back, it returned to Christian hands. A long story, very complicated story. But basically in the Crusader era, the grotto was reconverted back into a chapel, once again paved, again given an altar. The entrance was closed up a bit and given a new stairway to go down, and it was renovated in some significant ways. And basically from the medieval period all the way through the 20th century, then this grotto retained that character as being a pilgrimage chapel. It wasn't until the early 20th century that the church outside the grotto was itself rebuilt. In the 1920s, the Church of All Nations that we would visit today was built by the Franciscans. And so as of the late 20th, early 21st century, pilgrims going to this site are going to see the basic area of Gethsemane commemorated by a modern church, the Church of All Nations, which has a very small, very well cultivated garden area of 8 old olive trees. And despite what some tour guides might say, none of them go back to the time of Jesus. They're all probably themselves medieval in some way. But what is far less visited today is the grotto across the street, which today some Orthodox and Eastern, or I should say some Catholics and Eastern Orthodox pilgrims will still visit. Far fewer Protestant pilgrims visit it. But across the street from the church is this grotto, which has basically retained the same chapel features as it's existed all the way since the medieval period, and kind of like it existed all the way in the Byzantine period as well. So that's what we'd expect to see at the site today as we visit it as pilgrims.
So now let's talk about a significant event in the 1950s, the flood. And tell a little bit about what that brings to light, because one of the problems we have with the site is, okay, it's been commemorated for hundreds of years, well over 1,000 years. You can't do an excavation in it. But all of a sudden, there's a certain event that comes up that really kind of opens the door, so to speak, for the first time to be able to do that. Tell us a little bit about that event.
That's right. Really important moment in the history of this particular site. It was the winter of 1955 and 1956. As you know, if you've been to Israel in those winter months, there's just torrential downpours of rain. And there was one such torrential downpour in that winter, and the downpour actually flooded the chapel. And some significant damage was done within the chapel inside the grotto itself. It didn't affect the Church of All Nations, as far as I know, but it did flood the grotto and the chapel that's now there. And so with that flooding, of the grotto, the Franciscan Franciscan custodians of the site decided to take advantage of that disaster and actually renovate the entire grotto and kind of update some of its features. But in the process of renovating the grotto, what the Franciscans decided to do was first excavate it. Since this was such a rare opportunity to do some archaeological work, they were going to have to, tear out the floors, remove all of the medieval features, and that process would give unprecedented insights into the earlier history of the grotto. So to do that excavation work prior to renovating it into the modern chapel that you and I would visit today, the Franciscans appointed a young priest and archaeologist named Virgilio Corbo, an Italian excavator who was a member of the Franciscan order and had been, he would go on to have a very important career throughout the region, excavating sites like Capernaum and Herodium. But one of the early sites that Corbo excavated was, in fact, the Gethsemane Grotto. And so in the year 1956, after the flood and before the renovations began, Corbo oversaw the removal of the floor, the removal of all the liturgical features, and what he found was the entire history, or at least traces of the history of the grotto going all the way back through the first century. He found pieces of the medieval chapel that had long since disappeared. He found the Byzantine mosaic floor, or at least fragments of it. He found the dozens of Islamic tombs that were punched through the floor in the Islamic period. He found some of the art from the earlier chapels. I mean, it's an extraordinary excavation. But the other thing that Corbo found was the natural contours of the cave and a few features of the cave as they would have existed in the first century, in the time of Jesus. Now, sadly, most of those features had been either vastly altered or completely obliterated by the later building within the cave. But Corbo was able to find, observe, and document just enough of the natural grotto and a few first century features that we now were able to go back and give a preliminary reconstruction of what that site actually looked like in the time of Jesus. The main features that Corbo found, so again, this is in the 1950s, and he would publish his excavation findings in a volume published by the Franciscan Press in Jerusalem, published in the late 50s, early 60s, I believe. And it was in Italian. And because this excavation was conducted in an early time before kind of modern standards of excavation reports and excavation techniques, sadly today the report leaves a little bit to be desired. I mean, we're very grateful for Corbo and for what he had done, especially because once he did his excavations and once they renovated the grotto and returned it back into a chapel, we'll never be able to see what Corbo saw again. There's that modern floor now, and the features were returned. So you and I will never be able to actually see the first century features that Corbo found. So we are very heavily reliant on what Corbo had seen and what he had noted, as limited as his report might be. But basically what he believed he found is he found the original contours of the first century cave. He found that the grotto in the time of Jesus had a much wider natural entrance, for example, than you would see today, which was closed up by later building. So in addition to the original entrance that Corbo found, he had realized that the cave itself in the first century had been expanded out, right? So literally workmen must have come in the first century AD or maybe first century BC, and with pickaxes and literally carved into the limestone bedrock to expand out the cave so it could be used as an oil press facility. He found traces of that expansion in the grotto. As part of that expansion, he learned that the workers must have left some natural bedrock there as supporting architectural columns, which today are mostly encased by cement, but that's part of what he found. He found a water feature from the first century, a water feature that he called a cistern, just a plastered chamber that had been cut into the bedrock right outside the entrance of the cave that was clearly used for holding water. It was later turned into a Byzantine period crypt, tomb. But he found that water feature. But I'd say the most important thing that he found in relation to the first century site is he found evidence that in the space where the altar is in the chapel, he found evidence for what must have been an ancient beam press. right? Remember we described earlier how a beam press would have worked. You would take a large wooden beam and anchor it into a wall. The way you'd anchor it into the wall is by carving a circular niche into the wall, putting the beam into it as an anchor, and then underneath the beam is where you put the bags of olive mash, and you have the stone weights. Well, Corbo found not the whole thing. That whole structure, the whole feature had long since disappeared. Pilgrims probably chipped at the stones centuries earlier, and the wood and the ropes, of course, didn't survive. But what he did find was the niche in the wall that would have been used to anchor the beam for the beam press. And we know from other archaeological examples of beam presses that it's the right space, it's the right size, it had the right wearing in it. So Corbo made a very convincing claim that he had found the traces of a first century oil press within the grotto. And so then he published his findings in that Italian report from the 1960s. And then for the last several decades, that's pretty much what we've had to go on, is Corbo's excavation, his notes, and the idea that it's probably been confirmed that even though we don't have all the details we'd like, in the broad contours of what Corbo found, it really does seem that grotto was an important feature of the first century Gethsemane site in its use as an oil press in the time of Jesus.
So let's talk about some of the other features. So we've talked about the entrance. We've talked about the water feature, which we'll get into more in just a bit. But there were a couple of other features like the storage room. Talk a little bit about the storage room.
Yeah, so when Corbo was doing his excavation work along the southeast corner, I guess, southeast curve of the grotto, he was doing some work along the wall, and part of the wall unexpectedly collapsed on him. And he realized that when the part of the wall that collapsed was an artificially sealed opening to a chamber that existed off the grotto, right, in its back corner. And as he's clearing away the debris and he's seeing what's in the chamber, he really didn't know what to make of it. It wasn't plastered like the parts of the other grotto had been. There was no pilgrimage graffiti like he found elsewhere in the grotto. You know, as pilgrims use the chapel in the cave. So he didn't really know what to make of it. He just thought, maybe this was part of the medieval chapel at maybe some point in the medieval period. Maybe they sealed this up. He didn't know really when the wall had been created either. And so there were several features like that, some kind of room in the back part, which he just identified as a storage room that he probably thought belonged to the medieval chapel, and just at some point it was sealed up. There were several features that Corbo found like that he didn't really understand. He didn't know how to really make sense of it. And so in the report from the 1960s, as you're going through it, you'll see him give his preliminary interpretations and then move on. Yeah, it's a plastered water reservoir. It must have been a cistern for collecting water. Oh, it's some kind of room in the back of the cave that was artificially walled up at one point. Oh, that must have just been a medieval storage room. But what we can do today is actually take the few details that Corbo gave us of these features, and we can now reassess them in ways that he could not. Sadly, we'll never have access to the original items that he saw, so we have to do a little bit of guesswork here. But basically, if we take his published descriptions and his preliminary interpretations and put them into conversation with archaeological excavations of oil press facilities from the last, let's say, 40, 50, 60 years, what we can do, I believe, is start to refine Corbo's interpretation of the various features. And I think we can now give a more complete, a kind of a fuller reconstruction of what that Gethsemane site would have looked like in the time of Jesus that Corbo allows us to do, but maybe himself didn't fully understand in 1956.
So we've talked a little bit about what was found after the flood. What have you been able to contribute to some of these findings to be able to kind of reinterpret and bring different light to the various features that were found after the flood?
Yeah, so after Corbo published his findings in the 1960s report, scholars after that would often refer to the report very briefly and just say that, it seems like Corbo found a first century oil press facility or traces of it. And it would occasionally make an appearance in New Testament commentaries. I think Joan Taylor's article from Biblical Archaeology Review was one of the most important pieces that just kind of highlighted his work and largely restated Corbo's claims, which were really important to make at the time. What I've tried to do in my own personal interest in the Gethsemane site that has developed over the last 20 years is I've tried to take Corbo's findings and reinterpret them in light of the archaeological excavations at oil press facilities from the first century that exist around the country. And I believe that what I have found is that things that Corbo saw and recorded and interpreted can actually be either clarified, confirmed in some cases, but also in some cases reread in light of new and better information that Corbo himself did not have access to. And so what I've tried to do is try to basically update Corbo's findings in light of more recent discoveries. And as part of my work, I've tried to offer a very preliminary reconstruction of what I think the grotto itself looked like, how it functioned, just as a way to try to imagine the scene at the time of Jesus. And I do want to acknowledge up front that this is a very tentative exercise. I'll never be able to excavate in the Gethsemane grotto. Probably in our lifetime, we'll never see new excavations there. So we're going off of an old excavation report that itself was very incomplete. And we're trying to understand it in light of current interpretations of some of these features. That's a very tentative enterprise, and I acknowledge that. So this all remains very tentative, but I do think that it's that the reconstruction that I'm offering is a pretty reasonable one based on those pieces of evidence.
All right. Well, let's go through what are some of those connections that you made, so to speak. Do you want to just kind of walk through the cave, so to speak,
Sure.
and just talk through each of the different elements and what he found, and then how you've kind of reinterpreted or clarified some of the things that he discovered?
Sure. Yeah, let's just walk through the grotto. So the first thing that I'd point out is that Corbo was able in his excavations to articulate the larger entrance of the natural cave as it existed in the time of Jesus. And that's something that he notes in his report. It seems like he is correct on that. It probably would have been about a 15 or 16 foot wide entrance, much broader of an entrance than we would see today. Today, you just go down a very narrow staircase past an artificial wall, and it feels very constricted. But it seems that in the time of Jesus, the grotto had an open-facing mouth, kind of looking towards the north or northwest. It would have seen part of the slopes of the Mount of Olives. And so that's kind of feature number one. I'd say feature number two are the contours of the cave itself. Corbo's excavations were able to show us how wide and how deep the cave was. As I said, it was able to show us what the extension of the cave looked like as it was repurposed around the first century, probably to be used as an oil press facility. So a lot of those observations, Corbo seems to have had some really important insights and important identifications there. But I'll start with the first feature that I think we can probably reinterpret, and that is the location of the crushing basin. So as we mentioned earlier, the first step after harvesting the olives from the olive orchard would have been for workers to bring the olives into a grotto or into a cave and dump them into a large limestone basin with the large crushing stone where it'd be wheeled around and crushed into the olive mash. Corbo never did find the olive crushing basin, and he didn't even personally speculate on where he thought that might be. But what he did do is he did notice that there were these natural limestone columns that the workers had left behind as architectural supports. Most of the columns were completely intact, going all the way up to the roof. Today you would see those encased in cement. But near the entrance, the closest to the opening of the cave, Corbo did not find a natural column, but what he found was a low cutting that he believed maybe originally was the foundations of another column that maybe the column didn't survive. He called it P11 for pillar 11. And so he just describes it in his report as, oh, this must be the base of another column. I think that that's one feature that we could probably reinterpret. Rather than being the base of another natural column, I thought it was fascinating to note that the dimensions of that feature of P11 really do seem to match quite well with other archaeologically excavated crushing basins in terms of the base of the basin. So what I suggest is that what Corbo identified as P11, the base of a column, I actually think probably was the foundations of a large limestone crushing basin that would have been located right near the opening of the cave, which itself was common among these caves. They're usually located near the openings of the cave, not only for ease of access for the workers bringing in the olives and dumping them into the basin, but also because often the wheel of the grinder was operated by animals, like a donkey maybe, and just with donkeys, you're going to get smells and manure, and to have these things near the entrance of the cave actually is much more convenient than having it tucked away closer to the back. So I believe that the dimensions of what Corbo found, the location of where he found it, works far better as the base of the crushing basin that we would expect to find in an oil press facility like this. So that's the first feature, is the what I think is the foundations of the crushing basin. The second feature is the one that Corbo did, I think, correctly identify, and that is the location of the beam press. So if you, as we talked about before, after crushing the olives in the basin, the workers would then scoop up the mash, put them into these bags of loose or thin rope, frails, put them under a beam press. What Corbo found in the east side of the grotto, right near where the altar is today in the modern chapel, is he found along the back wall the niche that probably anchored the oil press or the beam press. And I think he's correct on that. I think that that's almost certainly where the beam press was located. So if we go to the grotto today, we could imagine going into a much wider opening, seeing the crushing basin immediately in front of us, and then turning to our left, a little bit to the east, and there we'd see along the back wall a beam press extending from the wall that we would expect during the harvest to have the bags stacked up underneath. We'd probably expect some large limestone weights to help weigh down the beam press and crush the olives. We'd probably expect to find a collecting basin to collect the olive oil that oozes out the side of the bags. Now, sadly, all of those features are long gone, right? Corbo did not find the beam, which we'd expect. It was later converted into a chapel after all. The rope, of course, wouldn't have survived. But even the stone weights and the receptacle for collecting the olive oil, even those didn't survive, although I think there's a really good reason why. And that is that we know from the Byzantine period onward, Christian pilgrims coming to the site would often see the features that were there and would often chisel away at the bits to take away little souvenirs of home, saying, I've got a little piece of the Gethsemane grotto or whatever. So I think it's probably the case that the grinding stone, the crushing basin, and probably the stone weights and maybe the receptacle itself, all of that had been completely destroyed, obliterated, probably by pilgrims chiseling away a part of Gethsemane and taking it back home. So Corbo didn't find any of those things, as we'd probably expect, but I think the traces of what he was finding do allow us to give, a reasonable, if tentative, reconstruction now of where the crushing basin was, of where the beam press was. So those are the first two, I think, main features within the grotto itself. The third feature that I've suggested is referring to that storage room that he found in the back kind of southeast corner of the facility. As I mentioned earlier, when Corbo was digging in that area, the artificial wall collapsed. He found this chamber, didn't really know what to make of it. He identified it as maybe a medieval storage chamber, and then he just kind of left it at that. He did give one other detail, though, that to him did not seem overly relevant. He left no top plan of it. He left no photograph of it, which is really unfortunate. But he did notice something really odd about the floor of that room in the back corner. And that is that he noted that the floor seems to have been cut into the limestone bedrock at a slant. So it's a slanting floor. And that in that slanting floor, he noted that it was covered with what he called in Italian a pattern of ridges and dimples, meaning a pattern of little dimple-like circles that were separated by ridges that connected them in some way. He really didn't know what to make of this. It was an odd feature. He noted it very briefly in his report and then just kind of moved on. What I noted, though, is I was rereading his report, putting it into conversation with other archaeological excavation in the area. I actually noted that at several oil press facilities, more recent excavations have found storage rooms that do indeed have a sloping floor and rows of small indented circles connected with channels that sound very similar to what Corbo described as the pattern of ridges and dimples within this space. What these features seem to be is actually part of a storage facility in a first century Gethsemane, in a first century oil press cave like this. The way it works is this. Once the workers would ladle up the oil that was produced at the press, they would put that oil into large bag-shaped storage jars, but then they would put those jars in a storage space in the back of the cave until the harvest was completed. And at the other sites where we see these rows of circular depressions connected by channels on a sloping floor, it seems that the way that storage space is used is that the circles are used for placing the rows of storage jars. They're now filled with the oil. Uh, and the slant of the floor and the connecting channels is so that just in case there's any spillage, right? Just in case either in funneling the oil in, it spills out, or maybe the jar breaks, or if for any reason the oil spills out of the jar, you don't lose the precious commodity, but the channels and then the slope naturally kind of channel the spilled oil into a gutter that could then still be collected and then restored. So that feature, as odd as it seems, actually was quite utilitarian. It was quite practical, a great way to line up your storage jars and to make sure that you maximize your oil supply. And it's only been in the last 20 years probably that those storage features have been noted at other oil press sites that have been excavated. And so when I saw his description of the sloping floor, pattern of ridges and dimples, and then I saw that those same types of features at other facilities excavated in the region, the suggestion that I made is that what Corbeau had actually found was the storage room of the first century Gethsemane, a place where the oil jars would have been lined up, the channels would have collected any oil that had been spilled into the gutter, and just another, I think, really valuable insight into how oil was produced in this space, but also, I think, some supporting evidence to Corbeau's identification of the whole space as an oil press.
Very fascinating. I love it.
Yeah.
There's
So
one more, is the cistern, as he calls it.
right.
Tell us a little bit about the cistern and how you've re-identified that, of what you believe it actually is.
Yeah. No, thanks for asking about that. So that is probably the final feature that I tried to contribute to this conversation. So in addition to trying to identify where the crushing basin is, where the beam press is, where the storage room is, I also returned to Corbeau's description of what he called the water cistern just outside. Kind of, it's a chamber that's cut actually below ground, so it's below the floor level of the cave. It's accessed by some steps going into it from near the entrance outside the mouth of the cave, but that would go under the cave into a small chamber that had a few steps and then a larger platform leading into a room that was fairly narrow, fairly short, but that was plastered with hydraulic plaster for retaining the water. And there was actually kind of an ingenious system that filled it. Apparently, what Corbeau had found is that there were channels cut into the roof of the cave so that when it rained, these channels would channel the rainwater down into a decanting basin that would allow the water to fill up and allow all the sediment to settle at the bottom. And then the water would go through a channel and deposit into this water chamber. It's really a pretty ingenious system that dates to the first century, similar to other similar features that we would see at other sites. But basically, given all this that Corbeau found, he just simply said, I think this is a water cistern. I think this is simply for storing water. And in the 1950s and 1960s, that would have been the common identification, is just to say, if it has plaster and it seems to have held water, it must be a water cistern. So Corbeau was following a very clear convention of his time. In the last 30, 40 years, though, excavations around the land of Israel have actually showed us a really important feature that existed as part of first century Jewish culture in the region, and that is a ritual bath or a mikveh, meaning that in the time of Jesus, late Second Temple Judaism, it was very common in Judaism to have stepped pools where individuals could come and ritually immerse, purify themselves so that they could handle sacred things or go into sacred space. And the ideas, the practices of ritual purity became widespread in the time of Jesus. And as I looked at the water features that Corbeau had discovered, I actually felt that in light of what we now know, that we can better identify this feature not as a cistern, but as a ritual purity bath or a mikveh. The measurements align quite well with other mikvaot or ritual purity baths at other agricultural sites. The steps and the platform is quite consistent with what these agricultural mikvaot look like. And so for various reasons, I actually think that we can reinterpret that feature as well. So if I'm correct, then what that would mean is that as a part of the Gethsemane Grotto, there was also a ritual purity bath for workers to purify themselves before harvesting the olives, to ritually immerse and purify themselves before handling the oil, before crushing the olives, before extracting the oil, storing the oil, before distributing the oil. And the reason why that ritual purity bath would be so important in the time of Jesus in the first century is because ritual purity concerns were so expanded in the time of Jesus that there were stone cups for ritually washing hands. There are mikvaot all around the temple so that pilgrims coming into the temple can all immerse before they go up into the sacred space. But also, we're finding now that associated with agricultural production around the region, mikvaot were also common features. The reason being is because no matter what is being produced by the agricultural workers, whether it be wheat or oil or wine or whatever, at least a part of that would be tithed and sent to the Jerusalem temple, which means it must be handled and produced and shipped in ritual purity. And so what we're finding anytime now we excavate these agricultural facilities, including oil presses, is there's almost always a mikveh nearby so that the workers could do all of these things in a state of ritual purity and produce oil that could be accepted at the temple as tithes or offerings or for other uses. And so I think that kind of fills out the larger reconstruction that I've offered with Corbeau's work between the grinding stone, the pressing, the beam press, the storage space, and then the ritual purity bath used to purify the workers. I think that gives us a really nice reconstruction, not only of what we would now expect to find at an oil press facility, but one that I think works really well with the New Testament descriptions and how we can imagine Jesus at the site.
Excellent. I love it. Let's now talk a little bit about the connection with the story of Jesus. Now that we've in essence reimagined what the location would look like, how would this connect? How would this help us tell or retell the story of the last events, the events of Gethsemane?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that the word you just used of context, that is the main answer to your question, which is, so what does this reconstruction mean for a reading of the New Testament Gospels? And I do want to say again, this is a tentative reconstruction. I fully recognize that we could maybe refine the ways I've interpreted some things, and maybe new discoveries one day will further refine it still. So I want to be very aware of that. But I think that the main contribution that this makes to our reading of the Gospel accounts is by providing a much larger social and physical context to the Gethsemane story. Before we get to the physical context, meaning what did it look like and how can we imagine Jesus and the disciples navigating that space, I actually think it's first interesting to point out the larger kind of social context of what that space would have been used for. Why would they have even gone to that space? So, in the Gospels, we read that after the Last Supper, it's now late at night, the night before the crucifixion. I mean, it doesn't say, is it midnight? Is it 1 a.m? It's just none of the Gospels say, but they cross the Kidron Valley. They go to this location where immediately all the disciples fall asleep. That raises a really interesting question of why would they go there, right? The earliest synoptic Gospels, Mark and Matthew, they both described that Jesus typically stayed in the village of Bethany, just on the other side of the Mount of Olives. Why would they stop at this oil press facility and all kind of fall asleep, and what's going on there? One of the other things that my research on this topic has produced, and I'm building on the work of earlier scholars as well, of course, is that when a site like this was not in use during the harvest season, so for example, when it's not the fall harvest, when it's not September, October, November, and it's not a busy hive of oil production, how would the space like this be used? It turns out, it seems that these types of natural spaces, like a cave in this case, could actually be used to accommodate the masses of pilgrims that are coming into the city to worship at the Jerusalem temple, to come for the pilgrimage festivals, who need places to stay. some wealthy and well-connected pilgrims might stay with friends in the upper city of Jerusalem, in those wealthy mansions in the upper city. Some, we know from historical records, would stay in tent encampments near the Pool of Bethesda to the north of the Temple Mount. But what about those non-elite pilgrims, right? Those lower class, let's say, pilgrims from Galilee, who don't have wealthy connections in the city, who may not have been able to travel with a whole tent setup, but who simply needed a place to stay for the night. Yes, they could stay in the nearby villages, but another place they could stay is in a natural shelter that they either use or borrow or rent. And that could include something like a cave, right? So one of the suggestions that I make in my research, building on some of my colleagues, is that probably what's happening here is that the reason Jesus and the disciples go from the Last Supper to the site of Gethsemane is because that was the place where they were going to sleep for the night. According to the Synoptic Gospels, it was a Passover night. The Passover traditions require that you sleep in the city, the same city that you eat the meal, in Jerusalem. And so maybe that night they couldn't go all the way out of the city to Bethany. Maybe they needed to find something that was affordable, more modest, somewhere they could just kind of bed down for the night as some pilgrimage accommodations, something just a cave that they could retire to after dinner that would, keep them warm at night, maybe dry if it's drizzly or raining outside. And so that's kind of the first thing that I wanted to highlight, is that the excavations and the research on the site of Gethsemane, I think, provides a bigger picture for the narrative itself. Like, why were they even there? I think it's because it's their temporary pilgrimage accommodation. I think that's where they were staying for the night, and we know that was true at other sites. We know of temporary lodging in caves in the region, the caves near Qumran, for example, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. We have traces of what it looked like for travelers to stay in a cave at night. And by the way, those caves of other travelers around the region left small finds that Corbo didn't find or record in the Gethsemane Grotto, but that allow us, I think, to kind of fill out the cave even more. I mean, these small finds remind us that in some of these caves that could temporarily house a pilgrim or a traveler, you might find a little hearth for cooking, perhaps, right? Or you might find little storage or little cooking jars, cooking pots for making thin soups or stews. You might find reed mats that were rolled out on the bedrock floor to provide just a little bit more comfort for sleeping or for sitting and eating. You might find little traces of olive pits and date pits, little snacks and things. So what's little maybe oil lamps that the travelers could use and provide some dim illumination for the cave at night. So all of those things, not to get too speculative, but we know that all of those features were part of caves that were used around the region by travelers. So I think it's also reasonable to suggest that if indeed the Gethsemane Grotto was used by Jesus and the disciples after the Last Supper as a place of temporary lodging for the night, why they probably naturally fell asleep there. I think we can imagine, based on comparanda, what else might have been in the cave. I mean, it's very possible. You can imagine them, going through the Kidron Valley, as you mentioned, going through, past the monumental tombs that lined the Kidron Valley, going up the slopes, up the main road that led up the Mount of Olives, but then turning off to the north, going to the Gethsemane Grotto, where they're all kind of getting ready for the night. We could probably imagine them taking reed mats and rolling them out on the bedrock floor to sit or sleep. We can, I think, reasonably imagine that there's some Herodian-style oil lamps, maybe putting little niches along the walls that provide a little dim flicker and dim illumination for that cave at night, provide a little bit of additional extra warmth as well. Maybe they had some traces of their snacks and their, maybe some cooking pots. I mean, those types of things are very common. So I don't want to be too speculative, but it's very reasonable that's the type of setting that Jesus and the disciples would have gone to as they kind of sat down, settled in for the night in a grotto like this. So that's, I think, the first one is the social context of why they were there, temporary pilgrimage accommodations. And now I guess the next question is, so how then can that help us understand the physical context of the gospel stories? And as we've already kind of alluded to, yes, we can imagine them walking through the Kidron Valley. This is late at night. We don't know what time it is. Is it midnight? Is it 1 a.m? We really just don't know. The Gospels don't give us that detail. But they are clearly walking in a deep valley, past the monumental display tombs of the priestly authorities that still survive today. Does make you think of the beautiful psalm, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, yet I will not fear evil. You can maybe speculate, use a little bit of imagination as something like that going through Jesus's mind as they're walking through the valley, and he's pondering the fate that awaits him as the burden of that gets heavier, and he's walking in the valley of the shadow of death, as it were, past these tombs. Yet I know in whom I trust. I mean, there's so many ways I think you can connect the physical landscape of this space with the scriptural narrative and the scriptural context. And then, as they're getting to Gethsemane itself, I think what the site does, the reconstruction of the physical site allows us to do, is now reimagine the whole scene as described in the Gospels. So in traditional Christian art, we often envision the scene as all being condensed into a grove of olive trees. All right. So Gethsemane art for centuries has almost exclusively focused on sleeping disciples by one tree, and Jesus kneeling or praying somehow by another tree. And it just really focuses on the olive tree component of the garden, which is understandable. That would have been an important component of the site, although I don't think I've seen any art that tries to capture the terraced orchard that we assume would have existed. But so that's one thing. But the other thing that the site does is it helps us remember that the setting of these Gethsemane narratives in the New Testament Gospels are so much more dynamic and interesting than the traditional art would suggest. Rather than just imagining a grove of olive trees, this Gethsemane grotto now allows us to wonder who was placed where in the scene. Unfortunately, the Gospels don't give us enough detail here either. So again, we need to be reasonable and tentative in our suggestions. But we could imagine a couple different ways of now reading the story. So, for example, when Jesus and the disciples arrive in Gethsemane in the synoptic accounts, and Jesus says, "Wait here, watch here, and pray while I go in a little further." What should we imagine there? Should we imagine that Jesus is telling the disciples to go into the cave, go into the grotto, and telling them to watch here and pray while I go a little further, and then Jesus separating himself from the grotto and going off to the terraced orchard of olive trees to pray? That's possible. That's one way you could read the story. What that scenario doesn't account for, or at least it doesn't really emphasize, is the nature of the Gethsemane itself. So maybe another way we could envision the story is just you flip the staging of it. Meaning, is it possible that when they show up and Jesus says to the disciples, "Sit here and watch and pray while I go in a little further," is it possible that he's actually putting them in the orchard of olive trees, maybe by the entrance of the site, and saying, literally watch, watch. There's a lot of pilgrimage traffic late at night going up and down the Mount of Olives, that main road. Is he's telling them literally, you watch here in the orchard, and I'm going to go in a little further and pray. In which case, could we imagine Jesus going into the grotto and praying kind of in that isolation? Meaning, could we imagine Jesus's prayer being on a reed mat on a bedrock floor, surrounded by dormant olive press features, right? A crushing basin, a beam press, the storage room. Could we imagine him kneeling there or on his face there, just in a cave illuminated by the dim flickering lights of oil lamps? And there he offers his prayer, where he tells the Father, please remove this cup if there's any other way. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. And he submits. Is that the setting in which that would have occurred? Is possible, actually. And I think that other scenario, that second scenario, actually itself would probably give a little bit more symbolic or maybe theological weight to the use of the name Gethsemane. It's literally Jesus in the place of the oil press, kind of feeling the weight, the burden of his coming fate, the weight and the burden of the culmination of his messianic mission on the cross tomorrow. And so, not to be too dramatic, but I think that really does give us a nice way that we could reread or re-envision the story. None of these things change the theological impact of what happened in Gethsemane. Archaeology doesn't make that contribution generally. But what it does do is provide us options. It provides us a broader perspective of how the physical site would have looked. It allows us to re-envision the movement of the disciples and Jesus, and it might even make for some really interesting scriptural connections of, imagine Jesus praying in a cave on the Mount of Olives. Well, it turns out there are lots of fascinating Old Testament precedents to prophets and kings praying in caves, or even in this case, praying on the Mount of Olives as they're fleeing into exile, or concerned about their enemies. There's a great story in Samuel about David going through this very same area and also weeping on the Mount of Olives as he is anticipating the conflict with his enemies. And so it just they're physical reminders at the site that I think broaden our ability to provide context to the New Testament stories, maybe see a larger biblical perspective on these stories. And so in my opinion, that's some of the value that the archaeology brings to our reading of the text.
Thank you. I love, one of the things that I love when creating this 3D model, because we've obviously gone in with your work and recreated it, is for the first time being able to see the view back to the temple that Jesus would have seen, that he's there in Gethsemane and he sees the temple. He is the sacrifice, and what's going through his mind, and the full moon most likely lighting up the area, maybe even glistening a little bit on the facade of the temple, and just this incredible view that he would have had that we can't really get unless we can really kind of reconstruct all of this, which we've been able to do. So.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's one of the great things that archaeology does, is it allows us to more clearly envision the dynamics of a scriptural narrative like this. It's not proving the theology of Gethsemane. That lays way outside the realm of archaeology and historical evidence. Those are more into faith and theological perspectives. But it does provide that physical context, which on the one hand, in my mind, brings the story to life in a very exciting way. These are real people caught up in real events, in real physical settings. And that's a great way to, I think, connect with the scriptural narrative on the one hand. But it also provides rich context. I mean, you mentioned the proximity of the site to the temple. It's really fun to speculate, really interesting to imagine what the relationship between the site and the temple may have been. Is it possible that this site is producing oil that would eventually supply the needs of the temple? Is it possible that whoever owned this plot of land is taking the oil that's produced at the site and just selling it to pilgrims coming to the temple? It just reminds us that it's part of a much larger context, a much richer social tapestry. And in my opinion, that's some of the strength of what archaeology can bring to a rereading of Scripture, is that context.
Well, thank you. This has been fascinating. Is there anything else that you just want to kind of conclude with, that you feel maybe summarizes or kind of brings everything together with some of the findings that you found, and obviously other incredible scholars that have kind of brought this story to life because of the archaeology and the different research?
Yeah, I think just to summarize what we've said, I mean, obviously this work is being built on standing on the shoulders of so many great scholars and archaeologists who went before. We are very indebted to Virgilio Corbo for doing the original excavations. We're so grateful for Joan Taylor and for other colleagues who have highlighted those excavations and kept reminding us to incorporate that into the way that we view Gethsemane. And I would say, just in summary, then I would hope that what we're contributing here is just a fuller understanding of how the site works. We're not trying to make any sensational claims. We're not trying to say, oh, we have found the authentic site. Although in this case, it does seem to be reasonable, right? Almost likely. But we're not trying to sensationalize anything or overstate anything. This is the only olive press facility on the Mount of Olives that has been excavated so far, and being able to reconstruct it in this way, I think allows us to just see the New Testament stories in a different light, kind of reread, reinterpret, reframe the narratives of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And this work will continue to go into future generations as well. I hope that future New Testament scholars and future archaeologists and future scholars can refine what we're talking about today, give even better interpretations, a clearer understanding of how the site worked, how it might be placed in conversation with the New Testament Gospels. So we're just one part of a large conversation that will hopefully continue as we put archaeology into conversation with the New Testament.
Well, thank you. This has been fascinating. Really appreciate your time and all the research that you've done. I mean, I feel like, as you said, there are many other scholars, but you really have, in my opinion, done the most to bring all of these pieces together. So there's different aspects, but you've been able to bring it all together into one, so to speak. So
That's great.
really
Well, I hope it's been
appreciate
helpful.
that.
Thank you.
So thank you for your time, and hope you have a wonderful Easter and everything like that.
Well,
So
thank you.
again,
You
thank
too.
you.
It was great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.